Okay, let's get into mixing anatomies. Now, before I go into the very specifics with like exoskeletons and tentacles, I want you to think a little bit about this whole thing at the tissue level. Why? Because anatomists sort of tell you a useful lie. We don't really purposely lie, but it's the way the images are drawn and the way people think about it. When we think about anatomy, and this is obviously a human knee, you tend to think about like muscles or the red parts, and then you have like tendons, the white parts, and you have bones and the yellow parts, and it's like they just kind of stick together magically. Here's another diagram. You can find it in an actual anatomy book where you have like the muscle fibers and the muscle packets, and they go together to make the whole muscle, and then they just transition all nicely to tendons, and the tendons just sort of stick as if via super glue to the bones. And there is a rare case where that's sort of true. You see how clear, this is an actual slide of tissue now, like cut through, in this case, muscle and cartilage. See how this is a thick cartilage cap. This is sort of an unusual condition often seen during growth. But see how there's this very clear line here where the muscle kind of hits the cartilage? This is kind of how we think about it, although even here it's not really true. Some of the muscle fibers do go through and kind of connect to it, or and some of the let's just say this is what we think. Here's what really normally happens. Normally you have tissues that sort of flow from one type to the other, where you don't have any kind of actual hard line. What you actually have is like a changing set of percentages of the fibers in the tissue from muscle to kind of connective tissue tendon to calcified tendon to bone. So like if you cut through bone of something dead preferably, where a muscle attaches, out towards the surface you'll have a whole lot of actual tendon-like material going into it and becoming ossified tendon material in between the bone matrix, and then eventually it becomes more and more bone until it's fully bone. And in fact, you see that here, for example, they've stained it so those hard lines here are part of a bony surface, I believe, of the shoulder of a person, and this stuff here is all tendon, and you can see it like interdigitating just in this one slice. And here you have two different types of the tissue being more calcified, and then you have this, again, up and down line here. They created the dots for you so you could see it more clearly. But you have a bone tissue, and then you have calcified tendon, and eventually you have like more flexible tendon and then muscle. But the reason I'm showing you this is that when you see a bone, like a fossil bone or a dissected bone, you still actually see this calcified tendon layer on top. You're not truly seeing the naked bone unless you really go in like with an acid and try to etch out a whole lot of the actual organic matter from it. Now, why does this matter? Because when we design things, we tend to think of animals as if they kind of have like hollow areas so that we can make things magically emerge, but in reality, there's always a basis for connection. And if you think about it, when you look at modern examples of trying to like attach an exoskeleton to people, what you see is broad attachments and largely external activities. And this, of course, is a suit that the military is researching. And here's like a more futuristic design, which I think is not actually being tested very much just yet like the other one was. But notice how like they have to have broad attachments physically to people, and then the actual stuff on the outside, because there is no internal space, so to speak. Brooke, the question about salmon muscle actually has to do with the type of muscle fiber and also how it's you're eating axial muscle, that is the muscles that insert onto the torso, whereas in chicken you're usually eating limb muscle. Even if you're eating like pectoral muscle, that's still limb muscle. And so you have very long fibers, whereas here you're eating fibers that are oriented in rows with then connective tissue also in rows. So when you cook it, it flakes apart along the connective tissue that like each rib and vertebrae would have. But also they do have some differences in like the types of muscle fibers they have and therefore how well it sticks to. And that actually varies even between fish species depending on like whether they're burst swimmers or long-term swimmers, etc. So for whatever that's worth. And even in fiction, you'll often see they have to solve this problem. Like in Doc Ock, although they often tried to hide it underneath his very conspicuously useful cloak, when they first attach the limbs to it, you see there's actually a big mechanical thing that actually is a plate there, so that even though in the storyline, like, it has little wires going down to a spinal column or whatever, like, they realize that they just can't magically attach these giant mechanical arms, tentacles, if you like, to his back. There has to be something there. And this is going to be the big theme, actually, as we cover this, that you can't just magically glue on or transition things. There has to be a functional design explanation for how you combine very different anatomies to get a working, funky anatomy. So let's take a look. First we'll look at actually arthropods. I wrote arachnids because I think most of you are familiar with that from movies like Arachnophobia. That technically really refers to like spiders and their relatives, not all animals with exoskeletons. But here, for example, is kind of a lobster guy. You'll notice they just kind of like here seem to like draw a line. Like, it's red and hard, and now it's like skin. It just works, right? Or the Scorpion King, my favorite example of what not to do ever. And the reason is because think about what this is supposed to be showing. This is an exoskeleton, meaning it has to be hard on the outside, there have to be tendons and muscles on the inside. And then you have normal human skeleton where it's like soft tissue, flexible skin over muscles and bone on the inside. And what is this? Like, even try to contemplate what this half coverage is. Like, this skin has to flex somehow. Is it sort of hard? Or is it totally hard? Now, I realize when you're painting texture maps that certainly you can go ahead and paint a gradient in here to blend them, but you can't make it work as an actual tissue. For one thing, the muscles that are here that are clearly human-like muscles still have to actually work. They have to have room to flex in this case. And the surface over them has to be able to flex. This is just like the exact wrong thing to do. It's a design trap. Don't do it. And honestly, I think this was ILM's biggest problem. I know I read the Cinefex years ago, and they talked about how much time and effort they poured into this, which I'm sure was really disappointing to them because it came across as one of the least believable parts of the whole film. And they centered on how hard it was to make essentially a full-figured person or human head. But I think the real problem, and they talked about this, was how much time and effort they put into trying to blend them together. And they should not have tried to blend them together. They should have made it look like one could have actually overlaid the other. Now, how would you do that? Well, the funny thing is we have a really good set of modern examples where there are exoskeletons on vertebrates. Turtles truly, and in a very real way, are a vertebrate with an exoskeleton and an endoskeleton. You know, it's an animal that has a real regular skeleton inside of it, but they also grow bony hard parts on the outside, and they depend on these hard parts. If you look at the inside of them, you'll see that like the vertebrae and the ribs actually fuse to it. This skeleton is holding the animal up. Here's another picture. The ribs literally fuse right to these. They can't move the backs, and the muscles, the axial muscles, don't do much of any work. Another important point is how they connect them. If you look at a turtle, you're always going to see they have this nice, beautiful, hard carapace made of bony parts. Same on the bottom. But notice there's always a leathery, soft tissue part that connects them and is flexible on the underside between the hard, bony part and the vertebrate parts. And that has to exist because those vertebrate parts have to be free to move relative to the hard, bony parts that can't move. And this would be true whether you're using a true vertebrate exoskeleton or you're trying to graft on a lobster or crab-like exoskeleton. You still have to have an area that gives you freedom of movement in between the parts that have bones in them and the parts that are bone, or if it's like a lobster, are chitin but can't bend. Have to. You've got to design this into it so that the two can work together. And by the way, a lot of vertebrates with armor actually still do this 2/3 of the way. This is an aedosaur, and that's armor all over the top and the ribs. Here's another aedosaur that's got a lot of armor on the top. Here's a glyptodont, which created hair-like armor. Well, it's keratin armor, but it's hair that fused together basically to make the armor. It's not even bony. And even living crocs have the armor so tight that the armor on top is used for muscles to attach to it, and actually it supports some of the back muscles, the hardness. Yeah, armadillos do something similar. And by the way, I'm not just telling you this because this is kind of a cool example, but look at this texture. Like, if you're trying to make an vertebrate that has an exoskeleton, you can make it look like a lobster or a giant crab, but it's probably even more believable if you have something like this with skin and scales if you want, if appropriate, but skin attaching to bone and keratin. These are the textures you really would probably find in exoskeletons on your vertebrates, this or turtle-like. Or, look at armadillos if you're making a very mammal-like one. Now, that doesn't mean you can't attach these parts. Please do. Just think of them as separate segments and be careful where and how you're attaching them. If you want to attach, a tail, and I know that, for example, putting scorpion tails on otherwise vertebrates has been popular, you need to have a part with a good hard break between these carapaces and the vertebrate body. And then there needs to be a soft tissue connection built going from there to add flexibility to it. So this, yeah, don't do that. But he could have had pinchers. That's not a problem. There just had to be a break somewhere where the vertebrate arm part went into it. Now, the limbs, of course, of animals' exoskeletons are often very skinny. It has to do to a degree with the leverage they have. Yeah, like a pincher glove, Ian. That's right. But if you think about these legs not just as food, although now I'm going to be hungry, but of course as real living things, you'll see that they actually have similar labeled muscles and parts to them. They actually have parts they call a femur and a patella and a tibia, and they're just segmented parts of the leg, but they have real muscles in them, and they're also filled by and large. So if you're going to have muscle, bone come down into them, you totally could. You probably don't want to attach them directly to the shoulders. I'll talk about that in a sec, but you could totally have a bone come into them for a ways, and then have these muscles attach both to the exoskeleton and to that bone prior to transitioning. And that kind of gives you a clue about how your soft tissue has to come in here, maybe even fold in or fold out, so that your vertebrate part would be able to bend against it. Just another example of labeled muscles. Again, let's lose the part way up here and have a bone coming in there, muscles, and you could easily have your muscles continue inside here again, as long as this was big enough to fit around the muscles coming in from the soft skin area. And again, as long as you had that transition from hard part to soft part that was flexible in here. I do want you to think about where you do these transitions. It's probably, and hopefully you can start to think about why, since we've done a lot with hips and shoulders, it's probably impossible to make a functional, plausible exoskeleton complete arm or complete leg that attaches directly to a vertebrate torso. If you're going to have the whole torso be like a person or a dinosaur or whatever have you, you probably need to have a vertebrate upper arm bone or upper leg bone with the appropriate hips or shoulders, whether they're mammal-like or dinosaur-like or what have you, and then transition them into the pincher-like legs, full-length sleeves or thigh-high pincher boots or what have you. Now, that doesn't mean you can't switch somewhere in the torso. I absolutely think you could, but like if you wanted to have a complete set of hind legs that were like this, you probably need to make the body transition somewhere into the scorpion-like body midway through the torso so you can pull it off. Likewise, with a scorpion-like tail, do I have one of those on here? No, I don't. Here's a good example of how wacky these shoulders are and how little they are. You can see how that's not going to attach to a vertebrate body usefully. So if you are going to do something like a scorpion tail, probably either have a scorpion set of hind legs or, and this is totally okay, make it a big muscular vertebrate tail as it emerges from the hips, and then, attach your vertebrate tail glove, if you will, or, turtle shelly thing over that. And, look at how many joints these guys have. it's not hard to pick a segment. I mean, they're almost giving it to you, but yet this animal has what's really probably a more vertebrate-like body underneath, and so this is probably not going to work as an attachment point. But yeah, look at all these beautiful segments on any kind of design that has an exoskeleton. It's really not hard to come up with a break, if you will, to go ahead and stitch together your vertebrates with your exoskeleton critters. And you can do it. Also, your TDs and your riggers will love you if you're in a pipeline, because these parts are a lot easier to rig than the vertebrate parts that have to all have sliding skin over muscles and all that technical BS that's so hard and expensive to do. This is an early sketch from the Thanator from Avatar, and I don't know what they're intending. The final result was much more classic vertebrate with some funky, almost shark-like elements in some of the skulls and stuff, but you'll notice here they actually had a whole lot of almost scale-looking or even exoskeleton-looking segments or on the head, and I think you could do something like that too very easily, where you integrated parts initially where it was almost acting like armor. Again, think croc and turtle here. And then if you wanted to, if this were your creature, you could later transition it to covering the whole torso and then having a set of, say, hind limbs that were totally arachnid if you wanted to. And there's no reason you can't do this. And in fact, I would say, you ought to. It frees up the design possibilities. Just be sure to design the transitions. Here's an animal that has both tentacles and arachnid-like limbs. So in a way, this is a great transition point to getting onto its tentacles, although I will say that if you look at this does do a bunch of things I said not to do. The limbs are pretty much entirely exoskeleton, and then they attach directly to a body that I'm not really sure, maybe sluggish. Definitely not arachnidish, though. There'd be a real problem with these joints up here and making them work. But the tentacles are kind of cool. So before we go on to tentacles, let's talk about the design implications here then, or review them real fast. When you're making your hybrids between animals with exoskeletons and animals without exoskeletons, at all times think turtle rather than scorpion king. And specifically, remember that you just can't plaster it magically as a transition. You can't just fade it in Photoshop from one to the other. Just because technology lets you do that doesn't mean it would work in real life, and it will always result in laughter-inducing animation if you have to animate it, because it just can't happen. You can't. Honestly, it would be like this. Imagine you had fur and scales, which you could mix together, but the person doing the mixing, rather than making the scales peter out or the fur peter out, simply started clipping a single fur texture, so it just kind of vanished as a gradient, rather than having less furs. That's essentially what you're doing in essence when you just fade out the exoskeleton, or even in this case break it up. You really need to have a hard-rimmed end of your exoskeleton. You can't do it the gradient way. Okay. Oh, I lost one of my main points, but that's okay. I think I've covered them. Basically, you gotta have a hard rim or hard edge somewhere to end it. And you gotta have a soft or leathery skin connective tissue then from the underside of that to the actual vertebrate part to make it work. Okay. You probably can't make this transition work right at the shoulders or hips. You really need to either have a vertebrate upper arm or thigh attach to a vertebrate torso, or you need to go ahead and actually make the torso itself switch so that you have an exoskeleton body for the entire exoskeleton limb to attach to. And as I ended, scorpion tail, same way. You either need to have the transition happen before the hips, or else you need to have a vertebrate tail with muscles and everything that then transitions to a shelled exoskeleton tail that's a scorpion tail. That's a good question, Isan. I actually show the shrimps later briefly. Okay, questions. This is a good time for questions. I have two. Feel free to type in other ones you have. The District 9 aliens are very cool in how alternative they are. I like what they do with the tentacles, and I'll talk about why in the next section. I'm forgetting how they animated their quote-unquote jumping legs. They do seem to make the body kind of transition to an almost exoskeleton-like lower pelvis and limb system because they're so skinny, but I don't really remember if they made it look like it had an exoskeleton. So I think the design concept is cool, but and to a degree, because they're intelligent, I think they skipped the transition because they could obscure it either with clothing or other elements of the design, and that's okay. So I think in general they're very interesting. I would want to see hypothetical internal anatomies before I said they're truly plausible, but I will give them high marks for creativity for going somewhere where you hadn't seen much design go before. They didn't just give us our standard human in a lizard suit sort of aliens. As far as the xenomorphs and alien, I have no problem with those at all. To me, the xenomorphs and alien look exactly like what you could get if there were no vertebrates on your planet. Remember I said, I think in the very first day or maybe even in the free webinar, that it's sort of a coincidence on our planet that geologically speaking, we still had really wide, broad, swampy areas at the time period when vertebrates got complicated enough to start experimenting living with limbs and legs in swamps. It gave us a whole bunch of factories, and that by the time you get to the Triassic, that starts to reverse and you start getting a lot more mountain building, and they start filling in those swamps, and you never get giant, flat, swampy areas dominating your coastlines anymore. I mean, we have them in a few places in the world, but you used to have them almost everywhere. Well, if those parts of Earth's history don't line up, then you really truly might not get vertebrates on land, or it might take so long that animals with exoskeletons might be dominating the landscape by then, in which case, something like an alien xenomorph is not out of the question. It probably wouldn't look exactly like that one because you wouldn't have a Geiger designing them, but you really could have something along those lines. So I think coming up with an entire ecosystem where that is sort of your design principle is totally okay. It might be fun even to have incredibly little vertebrates in hiding, trying to somehow eke out a living on a fringe, sort of like these days insects are these smaller, although common animals living sort of at these size outskirts of big vertebrates running around. What about fusing the segments to the body like armor and then transitioning the limbs from there? I have no problem with that, with one exception. So you're going to start out, yeah. So the thing is, in a vertebrate body, armor, I mean, if it's like a turtle armor, there's no problem at all, but I think you're thinking more like croc armor, right? Yeah, you want it to move like, okay. In that case, the initial segments could be fused almost turtle-like in that you'd still have to have the hard transition for the armor segments on top. But as long as they eventually curved over, that would be fine. All you'd be doing is coming up with several of those transitions with a bit of a rim to the hard part and a little bit of the soft tissue connecting it. But that would be totally fine. In fact, I like that idea. I think that justifies why the transition occurs. If the top parts are like armor, maybe on top to protect it, and eventually they expand over the body, and then you simply have more lobster-like limbs coming out from there, I think that's a great design. Obviously these things aren't going to show up on planet Earth, but I think there are utterly plausible ways to combine very different things for either fantasy or other alien environments or whatever. Right, and if you do find a giant lobster to fuse with, best of luck with that. Basically, if you have any external armor parts, coming down, it's not going to be able to fuse with the scapula. And this is the point, is you're going to have exoskeletons be exo. They've got to be outside. So if they're coming up or covering like where a human scapula is, you really need to have it on the outside and still have the human scapula and muscles going into it. Again, like maybe a full sleeve sort of a exoskeleton glove in that case. Yeah, Remy, you're welcome for the new headaches. I'm sorry about that. But I think it will make some of those designs even cooler. Okay, anyone else with questions right now? So once you hit the transition point, that's a really good question. At the transition point, you're going to have, of course, the turtle-like, or whatever you want to call it, like layer of skin going up to the underside of it, but you're not going to actually have it. It will not actually be like a glove or a sleeve at that point. The skin, the muscle is going to actually start transitioning to insert onto the exoskeleton itself. So the last skin you have is really going to be the skin running between the vertebrate-like layer that has skin already, and or scales or whatever, and then the underside of the exoskeleton. So if you needed to move a lot, like if, say, the exoskeleton runs way up to like under the shoulders, so you have to have a lot of movement, you might have to have the exoskeleton be a little further away to give you more skin to play with. If, on the other hand, you have it happen a little lower, like, I don't know, maybe down closer to the elbow, then you could probably make the transition a little tighter, since the actual flexing is going to be done with the exoskeleton down there by and large. Yeah, so no skin under the exoskeleton, or at least not for more than like the initial transition point. You know, the thing is, think of how many times people decide to, I don't know, do a cyborg, because what's neat about a cyborg is you can add a whole lot of details to model. You know, you can have pipes or gizmos or mechanical things rather than just having all the smooth curves. I think what's beautiful about this is it's not only more plausible as far as design goes, but it actually gives you that same access to very different modeling accents to add on. So I think once you get into it, you'll find it can really like highlight your modeling skills as well as your design chops. And your animator should love you because it should actually work, rather than, you know, ending up with Scorpion King. Yeah, Ian, that's a really good question. You know, when it comes to the flexing of the joints, they do have much more flexible parts of the exoskeleton. It's not usually built, it's not leathery because it's not usually made out of skin the way like we vertebrates have skin, but they do have internal parts that are more flexible to let them bend there. And I would suggest actually maybe just looking up images of like insect joints. And you should find pictures of them like open and closed to see it. And as far as cyborgs are a really interesting issue. Obviously, the classic cyborg has some of the stuff implanted into the tissue, and I don't have a problem with that. But you do need to think, like that's why I went into the whole like think of it from the tissue point of view. There isn't like a lot of extra space. Like if you're going to have it implanted in the arm, you still need to have enough arm muscle under there to make them work. Or if you want to like have a replacement, like some mechanical muscles, that's fine. But then you still need to have some sort of a transition. In fact, I don't know if you guys have seen like the Blade Runner guy from the Olympics. Not the movie Blade Runner, but the guy who has like those little spring feet on him. You'll notice like there's a definite transition with like a platform that connects his missing, you know, element of his limbs to the mechanical part there. And so with a cyborg, you really need to figure out a way to integrate some of that together so that you don't just have flesh like ending in a straight line on the mechanical part. Normally, I'd think the mechanical part would have at the least some sort of a lip, whether it's rubber or some flexible tissue coming up over the skin. to cover it, rather than just like a magical design where there's just a line and the skin ends and the machine begins. Yeah, and cyborgs would have been something really cool to get into, but I mean, I could have easily made this class into like 3 classes by itself. Like each one of these could totally deserve its own lecture. Yeah, yeah, the leather skin is a really good solution too. Absolutely, it is. And again, as long as you're engineering people or creatures, there's no reason not to. Okay, so I will let you know, I promise. Oh, that's a good question. The answer is yes, it could be, Tom, but no, it probably couldn't be like what you see on insect wings. Like when we talk about flight and we're talking about how like slapping dragonfly wings on a person like Angel from X-Men First Class won't work because those wings are designed to work in a very different way from the kinds of wings that would be big enough to make like a person fly, and B, you would have to have more strength. Insect wings are built on the fact that they're really light, and so the strength of materials doesn't scale up. What you could do, though, I think, would be to make a exoskeleton-like limb, with those kinds of limb joints, and then try to create some sort of a either some sort of exoskeleton-like series of veins connected then maybe by a more dragonfly-like panels, so the whole thing wasn't that sort of thin webbing, or else maybe even go the crazy route and make it sort of like overlapping elongated exoskeleton chitin feathers. You wouldn't want to break them up into feathers. You'd want them to be more like elongated scales, but I can't see a physics-based reason why that couldn't work. It probably wouldn't work in something dragon size, but I can't see why it wouldn't work in like the range of a big bird or a pterosaur or something. That would be a very interesting design, I have to say, and I can't see why it wouldn't be workable. You would definitely want them to be, again, like elongated scale-like things or chitinous feathers, because you want to have some flexibility to move them. Because remember, at the size of vertebrates, when they fly, their arms don't just go up and down mechanically. They actually have to like twist up and they kind of make a figure eight as they fly in order to shed some of the vortexes and avoid some of the drag that would be created. But yeah, you could totally come up with a solution that would work. Man, I wish I had more free time to do fantasy animals. There's some cool ideas there you guys and gals have asked about.